Welcome back. So if you've been following along, you'll know that these are the doors that close out the rear pressure bulkhead, or little hatch covers. So the next thing to do here was to get these drilled so we can put all the fasteners in to bolt those into place when it comes time to seal up the cabin. 16 holes in each one, so I've got the machine to do that. So here they are sitting on the rear pressure bulkhead now with a couple of clecos just holding them into place. So now it's time to match drill those holes through the actual bulkhead itself. So I just drilled a perpendicular hole through this bit of 1.5 inch square tube, and I'm going to use that to make sure I get fairly perpendicular when I'm drilling the holes. So I'll hold that in place as I'm drilling, and ultimately this is the outcome. So I've got the holes drilled now, and they go all the way through the outside skin and the core, and then the backside skin as well. And so the next thing to do is get there with the hole saw and take those out to, I think it was a 3/4 inch hole saw I used, because we need to put some hard points in there that are sort of compression sleeves that'll be out of FR4 fiberglass. So there's the hole saw on the drill, and here are the results. So just basically just took it through the carbon fiber, and then with a screwdriver just sort of peeled the front layer off, and then drilled it back through to the back side there to take the core out without damaging the backside skin. And so the next thing I want to do here is create a backing plate for each of those that's going to have nut plates installed on those. So I'm run and drilled the larger holes, and now I'm drilling the smaller holes that the actual nut plates get riveted through. And so those are just 1 inch spacing on either side of the actual where the hole is, and that screw there is just basically one of the holes, but it's holding the that flat stock in place while it gets drilled. And meanwhile, although Devon and Zach still have one more mould to actually create, they've started switching over to laying up some of these rib parts for the rudders, and this is Devon here just laying in the carbon fiber for one of those. And as you'll see here in a little bit, they pretty much got most of those done by the end of the week. And in preparation for our rudder cables that should arrive next week, Jeff has now bonded a couple more pieces of conduit there into the main spar on the upper side there. As you can see, and he's just, while that's setting up, he's got a bit of foam just holding that in place. So that'll just make it easier to run those cables there, and then they won't be flopping around once they're in there. And this, as I've said before, is the last plug that's actually going to come off the machine. This one is for the rear seat mounts, and you see Zach's just in the process of waxing that one up, getting ready to pull the mould. And then the only other remaining molds will be the ones for the ribs for the foreplane. And this is those backing plates that I told you I was going to create. So drilled all the holes, and now running the machine slowly around. Not really the most efficient way of doing this, but anyway, got it done. So there they are, and sanded the edges and all that sort of stuff, and cleaned them all up. And there's all the nut plates I have for those. So next job is to put all those in. And while that's going on, Devon laid up this one. So this is the door for the vent door for the cowling to let sort of the heat out of the engine there, and that one's all laid up now. And Britt finished welding up these rudder pedal hangers, so those ones are ready to go off to powder coat now, and they'll just be getting the usual gloss black treatment on there like you've seen on some of the other stuff. And he did a nice job on that, but then he always does a nice job, so I'm pretty happy about that. And here's those backing plates with the nut plates in place. And yes, we are still using nut plates because they're cheap and quick and easy to do. But anyway, so they came out well. And for the first time ever, here is the Raptor actually flying in ground effect. There are no wheels holding it up. So that's kind of neat. It's just sitting there on a couple of 55-gallon drums and some foam, and another bit of foam there under the keel to hold it. And it looks kind of neat like that. So anyway, we pulled the gear legs out so Jeff could work in there a little bit more where the legs are. And here's the tank off the test stand, and yes, it's only for the test stand. So Britt has fixed the leak in that with a nice long weld, put some rod in there to sort of beef it up, so that's that problem solved, and I'll be able to get the engine running again. And Jeff and the guys have got a bit of a rhythm going now with laying up parts. So here is one of the main gear doors. And again, this is kind of ends up being cut into three pieces when it's done, but it was better just to make one mould and just lay it all up at once. So here you can see Jeff is just putting a bit of resin into that core there to make sure it's nicely soaked. And the guys have got it bagged here now, and just about to put the vacuum on it to draw it all down, pull the air out, and have it pull down nicely on the core, as you can see. So that's a little called a frog, that thing that's holding on the plastic there, and then hook up the line and then pop the vacuum on the cylinder as you've seen before, and voila, it all sucks down nicely. So there's another one in the bag, so to speak. And the next step for the pressure bulkhead hatches is to cut these little compression sleeves out of the FR4 tube. So starting out there with the FR4 rod, and I've just put my little fence up there and set it to the dimension I wanted, which was about 1.1 inches, and I just basically just sort of cut it like you're slicing bread or slicing salami or whatever. So 32 of those later, got that all sorted out. And here's the fuel cut-off valves again. I think I've showed these before, and they're wide in because there's two feeds coming from the tank, but you'll see more of that when we put it in place. And here's those ribs that got laid up in the previous day. These are ones for the rudder now. So they're all cured and been popped and also trimmed off. So we've got pretty much all the ribs done now, except for, well, there's still a handful more on the rudder to go, but then there'll be the ones still for the foreplane. I believe there's about 20 of those altogether as well, but we still have to create the molds for those. And in order to bond those little FR4 tubes into place on that rear pressure bulkhead, I wanted to create a little jig that's going to help me align those. So I'm creating two of these little back plates that you'll see. Yeah, that's what they look like. They're basically just a mimic of the carbon fiber one, but they will just be used just to align those tubes in the holes there, so they're nice and perpendicular to that bulkhead wall. And you'll see more of that coming up in probably the next episode actually. And here's Zach laying up some more of the ribs for the rudder. So there was still a handful to go. I can't remember how many there were in total, but obviously 2 rudders, and it's not just the rudders, it's for the vertical stabilizers as well. And this is Devon putting a bit of cabousel in the tight corners there before the carbon fiber gets laid in. And I wanted to show you guys how the fuel tank vent system is going to work. So this is the vent in the top of the tank there, and it basically comes back and it goes inboard, and it meets up with the one from the other side, and also meets up with the vent line coming out of the header tank. And then those will actually go through this bulkhead here and come out. So this is behind the main bulkhead, and then they'll go into this reservoir here, and this is just like your regular coolant reservoir that you have in a car. And then out of the top of that line, or the reservoir, there'll be another line there that runs through this other bulkhead, and then runs up to the highest point in the fuselage there, and then out down through the bottom of the aircraft. And so the whole idea here is that if fuel expands in the tanks there, it'll actually fill up that reservoir before it actually runs out on the ground. And likewise, when it contracts again, it will suck any remaining fuel out of that reservoir. So hopefully this will solve the problem that most aircraft have. The full tanks, they always end up leaking fuel on the ground. And here's one of those main gear door parts now, with the all the plastic and peel ply and stuff removed, ready just to be released from the mould. And now we're into Friday, and here's the guys laying up the last of these ribs for the rudders and the vertical stabilizers. And these ones actually didn't have to bag these because they're fairly small. And Jeff's just getting in there and just soaking up a little bit of extra resin that was in there. So that's that one you were looking at before for the main gear door, released from the mould, and now it just needs to be trimmed and cut into the 3 separate pieces that it will be. And there's Jeff actually getting the work on doing that, so he's trimmed most of that off, and just on the bandsaw does a nice job. It still needs a little bit of sanding right up to where the little edge is there, but mostly done. And I wanted to show you kind of how I'm putting together one of the pin locks here, just to show you how this works. So those are the ones that you've seen before that I've milled, and I've put the little bushing sleeves in there, and these are the parts that Britt has just welded back together, or welded together for us. So it's a little actuator arm that lives inside there, so that basically slots in there, and I've done a little bit of work in there just to sort of make that fit nice and smoothly in there without any sort of catching or whatever. So then the bolt goes through there, that's AN4, and you see it's got a nice smooth action. It's not sort of sloppy in any direction other than the way it's supposed to rotate. And then the next thing is the pin, so that's the lock pin, and it has a hole through the middle of it, and as well as chamfered on the front edge. So that just slides in the back there and then through the bushing that's on the other side. And then you can see those arms sort of sit on either side of it, and again, nothing sort of binding up there, it's all nice and loose. You see how that goes through and past where that hole is. So the next thing is this little pin. So that's what that hole is in the side there for. So you can feed the pin in there, and it's a little bit tricky to do. You kind of need 3 hands to do it. I should have just put it on the bench and did it, would have been easier. Anyway, just getting it lined up there. You can just, once you get it lined up, you can just push it through there. And just use a little screwdriver to push it the last way through, and you see now that engages the pin, and so you can move it up and down. I still need to do a little bit of work in there. I think there's a little rough edge in there somewhere that's just catching on something when you move it slowly, but you can see the action's nice. And so the next thing, or the last thing to do, is there's a little cotter pin that goes through the hole in the end of that pin there, just to keep it in place. So that's what that looks like, one of those guys. And so that will get slotted through there and then bent and twisted, and that's one of the locks in place. So that's kind of how those pin locks work. Real simple design, but pretty solid. And I got the test stand fuel cell tank there bolted back into place, and put the fuel that I still had back in there, so about 7.5 gallons in there now, and no leaks, so that's good. So next thing to do is get the engine all back together with all the stuff that's off to ceramic coating, and then I can run it again. And here's my jigs and back plates and pressure bulkhead doors all in place there, sitting ready under the fuselage, so we can bond those little FR4 things in, and then bond the back plates in next week. So then that'll be another job done with respect to, closing out stuff on the fuselage. And now that the main gear legs are out of the way, Jeff is able to prep there of putting a hard point in for the other outlet for the main straight tanks there. So he's just prepping that surface there to put that hard point in, so we can put the fixture in next week. And there's the last of the ribs there for the rudders and vertical stabilizers. Devin and Zach got all those done by the end of the day on Friday, and they're actually on to laying up that mould for the rear seat mounts. And I braved the traffic on Friday afternoon to go onto the east side of Atlanta to go and pick up our exhaust and turbo stuff that was getting the ceramic coating. And here's a sneak peek. This is the top of the Y pipe there, and as you can see, it's done in this really nice grey that they have there. So pretty happy about how that turned out. And so the next step is today, Saturday, I'll be at the shop probably putting it all back together so I can get the engine running again. And there's a little sneak peek of what the exhaust tip looks like. And finally, one last thing, anybody who's been calling and leaving messages and saying, oh, can you call me back, I want to talk about the Raptor, I have to say sorry, and I just don't have time to talk to people on the phone one-on-one about the Raptor. There's just not enough hours in the day. And for anybody who's wanting to come by the shop or thinking about coming by the shop, again, still no visitors. We just don't have time to have visitors stop by. Eventually, we'll have another open house where you'll be able to see the aircraft when it's flying. Anyway, that's our update for this week, and thanks again for watching. Tune in next week. There'll be more interesting stuff to see.